Welcome, everyone. Here we're going to be talking about the arrival of agriculture and some of the early villages in the Southwest, as well as discussing a little bit about what agriculture and domestication mean in contrast to what gets termed in North American archaeology the archaic ways of life. Some of the earliest evidence of the presence of maize in the southwest part of North America dates to around 2100 BCE. And this is a very remote time period, especially when you consider the fact that in the rest of the North American area, north of Mesoamerica, this would represent quite possibly the earliest evidence for agriculture anywhere. But what's interesting about this is that there's a long period of its presence, possibly as long as 1500 years, before its adoption as a dietary staple. And this is in contrast to the role that maize played in after its introduction into the eastern part of the continent, the Mississippi and upper Midwest regions, where it transformed society. Huge increases in population and revolutions in social organization very rapidly upon the arrival of this crop. Now, it's possible that the varieties of maize that were being grown back 2100 BC, when it's first being introduced into the Southwest, were not as productive as those that were introduced into the eastern part of the continent much later. It's also possible that the landscapes and productive potential of these areas was dramatically different, and that's true. It's a lot easier to farm in the what's called the American Bottom, the richest farmland on the continent, near the confluence of the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, than it is in Monument Valley. So that's another possibility. And there's a lot of debate about why there's such a major contrast between these, why there's such a lag time in the demographic impact of maize in the Southwest. It's interesting, too, that recent research, especially now that we've gained the ability to use genetics on macrobotanical remains to study the different relationships between these, that the varieties of maize that are being introduced into what is today the American Southwest were coming specifically from highland central Mexico as opposed to the lowland areas. And so that difference in climate between large areas of the Southwest and the highlands of central Mexico may have something to do with it as well. Another interesting observation that has been made by recent researchers is that the initial use of maize in the Southwest may have been for the brewing of corn beer rather than as a dietary staple. And in that sense, because it was not initially, may not have initially been used as a foundation of subsistence, it may have been treated more as a luxury item, and the amount of effort and extent of its cultivation may have been limited. But it's still odd in the grand scheme of things to think that 1,500 years from its initial introduction, it was still being cultivated at a relatively low level. And then something happens that creates a massive explosion in its importance and use. And this may be some of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, if you recall, talking about things like nixtamalization that allow maize to be used as a dietary staple. A lot of research goes into studying these kinds of questions. Uh, what's interesting too is now looking at that genetic evidence, both of the maize and of people, suggests that maize first arrived in what is today Arizona at around the same time as a Uto-Aztecan migration from central Mexico. And so there's a complex history and relationship between these migrating populations with maize, agriculture, and a whole bunch of attendant cosmological components. At the same time as once these populations are established, there appears to be trade and exchange in later time periods and the introduction of new varieties of maize in contexts that don't necessarily involve population replacements. So sometimes these introductions of new ideas and technologies come along with groups of moving people, and other times they're transmitted from community to community without necessarily seeing population movements. And sorting that out and figuring out which instances in the historical past of First Nations peoples involved population movements, which involved contacts and transmission of knowledge and culture between communities, figuring out which one of those operated in these large patterns of movement of goods and ideas and crops and technologies is a particularly fascinating way to try to engage with the past. Some of the earliest villages that we see in the Southwest, remember this introduction of maize, the earliest evidences that we have from it are from sites like Bat Cave in New Mexico. They're not necessarily in the kind of Southwest village context that we've come to expect from so much of the media representations and so much of the contemporary First Nations people of this area. And so the introduction of maize doesn't really start to become a dietary staple until around the same time as we see the earliest villages. This is kind of a chicken or the egg thing. Are people forming these earliest large dense concentrations of above ground architecture or semi-subterranean architecture, relatively sedentary, semi-sedentary villages? Is that happening because there's this new importance of maize because they've now adopted this as a staple, or does the adoption of this as a staple result in the formation of these villages? It's an interesting dynamic to try to think about. Which of these was a causal factor, or are they just inextricably linked? And is it impossible to pull the individual threads of that particular causal relationship apart? Around 400 BCE, plus or minus, obviously, we're dealing with radiocarbon dates at this point in time. Sites such as Marsh Pass in Arizona begin to be formed. And it's increasingly likely, one of the really interesting things that we see from some of these earliest villages is that it's a pattern where you had these in-migrating agricultural groups occupying landscapes that were very sparsely occupied by foragers. The ideal locations for foragers that are well watered, that have pinyon pine, abundant game and whatnot, probably had the denser concentrations of groups, fair amount of use rights or some degree of territoriality, one might imagine. And so what's kind of interesting is that these earliest villages don't appear to be established in the areas that had the highest populations of hunter-gatherers. They, in fact, are in these more marginal kind of locations from a forager perspective. By transforming the environmental productive potential of a local area, through the introduction of maize, beans, and squash, and by modifying the hydrological picture through the use of irrigation and water capture management strategies, it's interesting that in the Southwest, in this landscape, farmers were able to live in areas that were actually marginal for foragers. And this runs somewhat counter to our expectations. We tend to see in more recent time periods the displacement of hunter-gatherers from all but the most marginal environments, the high Arctic, the Kalahari, the central desert of Australia, We see the foragers being the ones that are occupying these marginal landscapes. But this new research that's been coming out just in the last decade or so about the early basket maker period villages of the Southwest suggests that the farmers were taking advantage of their abilities and the transformative potential of agriculture to actually occupy areas where they would not necessarily be in direct territorial competition with the groups that were already on the landscape. And they established complex relationships with those already established groups. So the earliest farming villages that we see are in these sparsely occupied zones. And then the agriculture itself begins to diffuse sometimes into some of these previously foraging societies. But the initial arrival and initial establishment of this as a functional way of life appears to follow this counterintuitive pattern, at least here in the Southwest. And so it's another really interesting point to consider. In contrast to hunting and gathering as a way of life, agriculture implies modifying the environment in order to extract more resources from a given landscape than are accessible to humans in its unmodified state. Um, and both animals and plants can be modified as a result of human intervention to the point that they're unable to survive on their own. And this is domestication. And ultimately, if it's established long enough, agriculture changes the landscape itself in important ways. Um, the central question is, why did agriculture evolve, emerge? Why was it adopted, arise in the first place? Especially given the increased workload and risk involved when compared to hunting and gathering. The effects of farming are manifold, and we'll talk about a few of them here. And remember, these are some general patterns that we see with domestication and farming. And what I'd like you to do is think about how these general effects, general patterns, concepts would have been playing out in the context of the First Nations of the Southwest and that particular landscape. The growing of a single crop in a field, by definition, substitutes a biological monoculture for the complex ecological system that existed on the same ground previously. And this change has several effects. One, obviously, the quantity of food available to people is greatly increased. But there are costs to this strategy. Over a relatively short period of time, growing a single crop can deplete even very rich soils. And maize in particular is really hard on soils when it comes to nutrients like nitrogen, which is one of the reasons we'll talk about here in a minute, that growing maize by itself can actually be a hazardous occupation. And this depletion of soils is actually a problem which rendered many early agricultural sites from the Near East to the Southwest uninhabitable after a time, particularly in both really arid environments, as well as in really wet environments like tropical rainforests. Both have, for different reasons, but both have this problem of soils that are more fragile than soils in more temperate environments. And it's still a very serious problem. If you look at places like the Central Valley of California, they've had significant difficulties. There, a lot of it has to do with the increasing salt content of the soil as opposed to a lack of nutrients. But the different challenges that different kinds of soils and environments present are ones that people have been confronting for thousands of years. Some of the unintended effects of farming, though, have had just as much of an impact on history. By doing this, human farmers are consciously altering the environment and selecting for the plants they need. but they're also at the same time selecting for any organism that can live on wheat, for example. Wheat eating vermin, pathogens, diseases of wheat are all going to increase their populations at the same time as you increase the population of wheat. So paradoxically, by increasing the food supply, farmers simultaneously increase threats to their food supply. If you have, you know, 5 stands of wild plants that you're relying upon, and they're spread out from one another, if one of them gets infested with a particular pathogen, that stand may be out, but you've still got the 4 other ones that are 2 miles away from each other, and you'll be all right. You'll just use those other patches. But if you begin farming and concentrating all of your food plants in one area for increase of production and convenience of location, etc., and that field becomes infested with a particular pathogen, it's likely, in the absence of 21st century type agri-science interventions, that whole field will be lost, and you'll be in a bad way. Farming also can create a biological system that lacks flexibility to resist disease or climatic changes. For example, the Great Potato Famine in Europe, classic case. The original domesticators of the potato, the farmers of the Andes, grew a wide variety of potatoes. Some that were okay with cold weather, and some that liked it warmer, some that were okay with it being really wet, and some that were okay with being dry. And so you would plant a whole bunch of different varieties in the same field. And some of the varieties that you planted would not fare so well in any given year, but others would be fine, or others would really enjoy, the conditions of a particular year, which meant you were going to get about 80% or so of what your maximum potential could be. If you had advance warning that, oh, okay, so this year is going to be like this, I can look into my farmer's crystal ball and I can see what this entire year is going to be like, and then select the ideal variety of potato for that particular year, well, then, yeah, you would be able to plant the ideal variety. But since you don't have that ability to see into the future, 80% production, regardless of what conditions pertain, is better than sort of going with the poker players all in when you have no idea what's going to happen moving down the line. It's about either trying to maximize production, or trying to guarantee a stable amount of production. And these are different kinds of economic choices that people make. What happened in Europe was that the Europeans selected the highest producing variety of potatoes, and they grew one variety of potatoes in these areas. And as a result, the pathogen, the fungus that infected the potatoes, wiped out entire harvests, and millions of people, not just in Ireland, I mean famously in Ireland, but millions of people across Europe died of starvation. The situation in Ireland was particularly bad in Europe because the Irish were under colonial occupation by the English. And as a result, there were more people, there are fewer people living in Ireland today than there were in 1840. It's important to think about the long-term impacts of some of these things. Yes, farming can produce a large surplus and support much larger populations, but if something goes catastrophically wrong, it goes really wrong. The other thing that agriculture does is that it means sedentism. You have to live permanently in one place if you're going to do this with any kind of to any kind of serious level. This was itself new to human beings and may have seemed very constraining to the first people to experience this way of life. It can't have been, an easy adjustment, I would imagine. And living in that one spot permanently means exploiting a relatively small amount of land very intensively rather than exploiting a large amount of land extensively as hunter-gatherers did. Um, and this changes people's relationships to the environment, changes their relationships to the landscape itself, I should say, not just the environment we think of living things, but how big are your horizons in some ways, and how do you relate to them? Is that over there? Is that someplace that you're going to be, or is it just someplace that you know about? Is it someplace you travel to, or is it your home during the summer? And these are different kinds of relationships that people have, and so then their attachment to particular landmarks and particular mountains and rivers and places changes as a result of this sedentary way of life. And it's very key, particularly in the Southwest, as we'll talk about as the semester goes on. These challenges, you have, again, that dependency on relatively few plants. This has nutritional consequences. This has, by relying on relatively few plants, you have to do everything in your power to make sure that it works out, to ensure that nothing goes wrong with these situations. You have greater vulnerability to weather. If you have storms, if you have tornadoes, if you have floods, if you have droughts, agricultural life bets the life of the community on weather patterns that are favorable to the few plants it cultivates. And so agriculture continues the ancient dependency of human life upon natural ecological systems like the weather cycle, but it raises the odds of disaster in any given year. And another thing is that the cycles of the year were always important to hunter-gatherers, different plants and animals and animal migrations and birds and all of these things. It wasn't like agriculture caused people to invent the concept of the seasons. Hunter-gatherers are well acquainted with that. But for farmers, you become very dependent upon the harvest. And sometimes maybe there's 2 or 3 harvest times, depending on where you are. Sometimes there's only one. The further, the closer to either pole you get, the shorter the growing seasons and the less likelihood of multiple harvests you have. But depending on whether you're growing multiple kinds of crops, maybe one kind of crop comes into season earlier than the other. But you're dependent upon those harvest times. You have to harvest that field of maize at one point in the year. It's not like it's available all year long, like some other hunter-gatherer resources, or some other cultigens, not necessarily domesticates, like we'll talk about later. We'll talk about agave. And so nothing can be allowed to interrupt the harvest. And the cycles of the year become increasingly focused on the build up to that time, right? And there's that narrow window also of opportunity for planting and cultivating at the beginning of the cycle. The harvest happens at one time, but that also means that the planting has to happen at a particular time in order for everything to work out on the schedule of the year with rainfall and frosts and everything else. And that importance means that measuring time on a much more precise and predictable fashion rather than looking for the natural signs of when the geese are moving or when the antelope come down, from the river valley. That tells you what's going on. When you're talking about having to plant and cultivate, you're having to calculate how much time, how much labor, how much land area you need. All of these different things become factors rather than being more flexible to the natural cycles as they occur. And also, Agriculturalists have to store the produce of their fields for the rest of the year, protect it from moisture, vermin, thieves, and learn to dole out supplies in measured quantities so the community can survive and have seed for next year's planting. If you eat all of your seed crop, then there's nothing left to plant, and you are really in a very bad way, to put it mildly. And so these conditions and requirements of planning and management created a new kind of lifestyle that had not really existed before. Not because people discovered that seeds, that plants grow from seeds, but because you were now developing this dependency relationship to a smaller set of resources that required a whole different kind of relationship between people and those resources than had existed during hunting and gathering times. Another thing that is key is that there's a need for intense physical labor here. You might call it drudgery, not just, and it's at several times of the year it gets really intense, but throughout the entire year, farmers are working from dawn until dusk and on a scale previously unknown. You don't need anywhere near as many people focused on one task in most hunting and gathering situations as you do with farming. The only comparable analogy I can think of would be hunting and gathering societies that have salmon runs, where you have to coordinate the activity of the entire community, and you're working 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, to catch and prepare and smoke and store as much salmon as you possibly can during that short window of availability. But in places like the Southwest, where you don't have salmon runs, the difference between the archaic hunting and gathering patterns of labor and the scale of these things, nowhere near what you would have seen once agriculture is adopted in a big way and people really begin committing to this as the foundation of their subsistence practice rather than as something that they were doing casually to make some beer out of. But really the foundation was elsewhere. Once it becomes foundational, then you're committed to doing this. You don't have a choice. And the coordination of that is key. Both men and women were working in the fields, and this new way of life molded people and society in new ways. The amount of coordination that was necessary, the amount of sort of community focus on these things, because especially in areas that are somewhat marginal to agricultural productivity, it's exceptionally difficult to do any kind of large scale production on one zone. This is something where you have to have a number of people and households and communities pulling together in some cases. As we talked about elsewhere in the world, the growth of epidemic diseases increased with the introduction of agriculture and sedentism and living in one place. In the Southwest, because the populations, at least during this period of early villages, were relatively small. You're not talking about populations anywhere near 1,000, maybe a couple hundred in most of these early agricultural villages, and combined with the fact that the large-scale crowd diseases of the Old World were not yet introduced into the Americas, and the extreme aridity would have reduced the transmission of any waterborne illnesses. Probably the only significant pathogen that might have increased during periods of sedentism would have been things like tuberculosis because of their transmissibility between people. But here in the Americas, this was probably less of a factor than it was in other parts of the world. Where some natural food resources, like we were talking about, with salmon. They that are abundant but seasonal. They can be gathered while available and stored on a large scale, and they can become a staple food year round. And we talked about some of the comparisons with the Near East. It is interesting that the Near Eastern Neolithic and the sort of ancestral Puebloan history have some interesting parallels, especially in the architecture. If you look at the architecture of places like the Rio Grande Pueblos and Acoma, and you look at some of the reconstructions that have been done for places like Çatalhöyük and Ain Ghazal, there's some pretty marked similarities there. Also similar is the lack of intense structural inequality, lack of major inequalities between individuals in terms of grave goods, lack of any kind of palace structures in these Puebloan style architectural units. So there's some parallels between these areas that deserve further exploration. Um, it's interesting that people opted to process and store portions of the surplus and settle down on a year-round basis. And so for the first time, you have the emergence of a strongly sedentary pattern. This was not a process that happened overnight. Um, and the decrease in mobility is something that I think is also interesting, especially given the um, unstable nature of things like rainfall in the Southwest. Here's just kind of an example of storage of surplus for some of these early settlements in the Southwest. You can look at different kinds of architecture as well. Northwest coast plank houses, bottom right there, compared to the Southwest Pueblos. Uh, but I do find it interesting that there's been, I think, relatively little comparative architectural analysis for Western North America. I think partly because there's this assumption of uh, this primitivist attitude that people have towards looking at First Nations history. But really, you can see just here with these 6 examples on this slide, there's a fair amount of diversity in how that occurs. With the uh, top left and the center on the top row there, between the Puebloan structures versus the Navajo Hogan, these are structures that are being occupied and inhabited and constructed contemporaneously in areas of the Southwest. And so, what do those different kinds of architecture tell us about the societies that are building and occupying them? A really interesting question that we'll get into as we delve into the Navajo later this semester. Maize, back to that one, and to wrap up this particular lecture. Maize, or what people in the United States tend to call corn, was first domesticated in Mesoamerica thousands of years before it was introduced into the Southwest. In and of itself, it is a highly adaptable plant, and selective breeding over centuries created hundreds of subspecies able to flourish in such diverse climates as New England, the arid Southwest, the wet tropical lowlands of Mexico and Guatemala, mountain plateaus 9,000 feet high in the central Andes of South America. There are very few crops in the world that can be grown, depending upon the variety, in as many different kinds of ecological settings as maize. It is remarkable in that sense. It has some important advantages over grains like wheat or barley. The seedbed preparation can be accomplished with a digging stick. You do not need a plow. You do not need deep, lush soils to grow maize. You can find enough soil in the cracks of a limestone karst topography in the Yucatan to grow very productive maize fields. It doesn't require the best kinds of soils, and it doesn't require a whole lot of intensive technology to prepare for it. Harvest of maize is much easier than the harvest of things like wheat or barley. With maize, you walk up to the stalk and you twist off the cob, as opposed to having to scythe down the bunches of, or the sheaves of wheat or barley, bundle them, dry them. Then you have to thresh them and winnow out all of the chaff. Harvesting of maize, by contrast, much easier. And the standing crop of maize is much less easily spoiled by moisture or wind. It can stand up to more rain and wind than can wheat or barley. Just look at the thickness of a corn stalk compared to a wheat stalk. Most importantly of all, however, the return on seeds planted was as high as 45 to 1, even at a very early date, with very small cobs of only a few inches long. You're still getting 45 to 1 return on your seed crop to produce. In contrast, the early wheat farmers of the Near East may have realized only a 6 to 1 return on seeds planted. So you can imagine, right off the bat, maize has an incredible multiplier effect versus, when you consider how much seed do you need to save over the course of the year in order to be able to plant a similar, or to plant a new field and get a similar amount of produce the following year. You have to save a much smaller percentage of your overall harvest with the maize. But it took much longer for people in the Americas to begin to rely upon maize as a domesticated food supply. This relates to things we talked about earlier in the semester with regard to the enzymes in maize having a deleterious effect on the body's concentration of niacin, and the effect that can have if it's carried to an extreme degree is the nutritional deficiency referred to as pellagra. And this can be counteracted by cooking corn with lime in the water, not the fruit lime, but the calcium carbonate lime, or ash, or burned shell, or whatnot. And that then bonds with these enzymes in the maize and prevents it from stealing the niacin from your system when you eat it. But this process of nixtamalization may have been something that emerged after the initial domestication of maize, probably sometime around its period of introduction into the Southwest, interestingly enough. And eaten together, maize is excellent in terms of its nutritional value. And eaten together with squash and beans, the other staples of early American agriculture, it provides all the amino acids necessary for human life. You need a little bit of animal protein to complete the picture, but compared to other grains, it's remarkably, in this Three Sisters pairing, complete. And the First Nations of the Americas knew a great deal about the nutritional intake from these various foods. Beans provide needed protein that corn does not. And once people had discovered nixtamalization, populations in places like Veracruz and Tabasco, the heartland of the Olmec civilization, populations rapidly increased, and you have the emergence of state-level political organizations shortly after the time period that we're talking about, the first introduction of maize into the southwest part of North America. This concludes the first part of our discussion of the emergence of villages in the Southwest. When we come back next time, we will be talking about the beginnings of ancestral Puebloan history and Chaco Canyon. I hope you guys are having a good week, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Have a good one.